I saw Kanye West get hypnotized by the industry, and he hasn't been the same since. What I witnessed that night wasn't just another breakdown, it was the birth of something unnatural, something controlled. The man who once defined creativity and rebellion became a puppet, his every move orchestrated by forces darker than anything he could have imagined. But what happened next shocked me to the core. The procedure wasn't just about unlocking his genius. It was about breaking him down until there was nothing left but a vessel for their will. And the worst part? He didn't even realize it was happening. I had always known Kanye West was unpredictable. His genius came with a certain madness that everyone around him could feel, a strange energy that electrified every room he walked into. But nothing prepared me for the night I was invited to witness the beginning of something I'd never be able to unsee. It was a quiet night, the kind where the city buzzes under a heavy blanket of anticipation, as though everyone's waiting for something big to happen. The usual whispers in the industry had been growing louder about how Kanye had become more distant, more unpredictable. It wasn't just the pressure of fame anymore. People were starting to say there was something off about him. No one could quite put their finger on it, but I knew there was something darker lurking beneath the surface, something that was gradually consuming him. I was just a bystander, a small player in the background of the superstar's life. But that night, I was asked to sit in on something different. An invitation that promised to reveal the truth behind Kanye's unraveling. I thought I was just going to witness another routine industry meeting. But as I walked into that cold, sterile room, the weight of what was about to happen hit me like a freight train. I had no idea that the night would change everything. Kanye stood there, calm, almost eerily still. He looked like the Kanye I'd always known. Brilliant, confident, the man who had never been afraid to speak his mind. But there was something unsettling about the emptiness in his eyes. Something distant, like he was already miles away, not really there with us. The people in the room were murmuring, talking in hushed tones, their eyes constantly flickering between Kanye and one another. They were professionals, managers, agents, psychologists, but they weren't looking at him the way a team looks at a superstar. They looked at him like he was a project, like they were preparing for something. The procedure, as it was called, was something that no one could talk about openly. All I knew was that it was supposed to enhance Kanye's mind, unlock hidden creative potential, maybe even give him that spark he'd been missing lately. But as I looked at him standing there waiting for the session to begin, I felt an unease creep into my chest. There was something wrong. No one was addressing the elephant in the room. The fact that Kanye had already been changing, already showing signs of losing control. The hypnotist entered the room, a man I had never seen before. He was dressed in a crisp black suit, his demeanor cold and clinical. He didn't smile when he introduced himself, and his eyes didn't linger on Kanye for any longer than necessary. He was here for a job. No one told me exactly what the procedure would entail, but the fact that I had been invited to witness it felt unsettling. They made it sound like it was a routine procedure, a way to enhance Kanye's creativity, to unlock his mind's potential. I told myself it was just another one of those things the industry did to make their stars bigger, better, more marketable. But this wasn't just another publicity stunt. I could feel it in the air. Kanye barely acknowledged the hypnotist, and it wasn't because he was being rude. It was as if he had already detached from the world around him, like he was waiting for something to happen, waiting for the procedure to take hold. The hypnotist's voice was soft, soothing even, as he instructed Kanye to relax, to let go of any remaining tension. As Kanye sank into his chair, his eyes lost focus. The energy in the room shifted. The calmness of the hypnotist's voice seemed to draw Kanye deeper into the trance, and with each word, the personality we knew Kanye to have started to fade. What was left in its place felt almost vacant. I watched in silence as the hypnotist's voice guided him further down into the trance, his words growing softer, more deliberate. There was no turning back now. I didn't know what this was supposed to accomplish, but I could see that Kanye was completely surrendering to whatever this procedure was. His usual fire, the one that made him Kanye West, was being extinguished, replaced by something else. Something cold. It was impossible to ignore the fact that this wasn't just about mind enhancement. This was hypnosis, but it felt like something far darker, far more invasive. There was no clear boundary between who Kanye was and who he was being turned into. I could almost hear the shift inside him, like the gears in his mind turning, pulling him in a direction he didn't want to go. Something was happening to him, something that wasn't natural. As the session continued, the room grew heavy with tension. No one spoke. The hypnotist's voice was the only sound in the room, smooth and hypnotic, as Kanye sat there, unblinking, unmoving, completely under his control. It was as if the man I had once admired was slipping away, slowly, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. The hypnotist began to ask Kanye questions, and his responses were slow, disjointed. There was no spark behind them, no usual Kanye defiance or wit. It was like he was answering without even knowing why. He was a puppet, reacting to the commands that came from the hypnotist's voice, not his own thoughts. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't just about creativity. This wasn't about unlocking his potential. This was about control. Control over a man who had always fought against being controlled. And for the first time, I realized something terrifying. The industry wasn't just shaping Kanye's career. They were shaping him. The moment the session ended, I could feel the air shift. Kanye's eyes snapped open, but he wasn't the same. He didn't even seem to remember what had just happened. He looked around the room as if waking up from a dream, but his eyes were dull. There was a coldness to him now, an emptiness I hadn't seen before. For a moment, I thought he might say something, but he didn't. He just stood up, nodding at the hypnotist as if everything had been fine, as if the man I had known for years hadn't just disappeared into a void. But it was too late. The transformation had already begun, and nothing would ever be the same again. The weeks that followed Kanye's first session were nothing short of surreal. The industry buzzed with excitement as his new music hit the charts, praised for being more raw, more emotional, even more groundbreaking than anything he'd done before. On the surface, everything seemed fine. But beneath the accolades, I could feel the growing tension. There was something haunting about Kanye's transformation. Something unnatural. The change wasn't just in his music. It was in him. Kanye wasn't the man I had known. At first, it was subtle. A slight shift in his behavior, a quietness that replaced his usual outbursts of passion. But it didn't take long before I realized that what I had witnessed during that first session wasn't just a temporary phase. It was a beginning, the start of something far darker. He was being changed, manipulated, not by his own will, but by the force that controlled him now. I had seen celebrities go through pressure and turmoil before. Cracks in their public facades, the constant mental strain, the need to be something they weren't. But this was different. Kanye wasn't cracking under pressure. He was being remade. It wasn't long before Kanye was called back for another session. I wasn't told much, but the invitation felt more like an order. The industry needed him to perform, and they needed him to be something more than just an artist. They needed him to be a product, something their hands could mold, shape, and control. That second session was where I began to understand just how far they were willing to go. The hypnotist was there again, but this time, he wasn't alone. There were more professionals in the room. Doctors, psychologists, people who looked like they belonged in a lab rather than a recording studio. Their faces were blank, like they had no idea who Kanye was or what he had been. To them, he was just a specimen, an experiment, a project. The industry needed results, and Kanye was the raw material. When Kanye walked in, he seemed distant. There was no fire in his eyes, no fierce creativity that had once fueled his music. He was almost docile, like a man walking through fog, his movements slow and deliberate. His body language was off too, uncharacteristically still, as though he didn't quite know where he was or what he was doing here. I tried to look into his eyes, hoping for a sign of recognition, but I found nothing. It was as if he were already someone else. The hypnotist asked Kanye to sit down. Kanye did so without protest, his hands placed neatly on his knees, his back straight, his head lowered. The way he followed instructions, without hesitation, without a spark of his usual arrogance, told me everything I needed to know. He was losing himself. As the hypnotist began to speak, I could feel the tension in the room build. The voice that had once been powerful, the voice that had led a revolution in music, was now subdued. The hypnotist's commands were slow, deliberate, almost meditative. But there was something more dangerous lurking beneath the surface. This wasn't just hypnosis. It felt like a systematic reprogramming, a process designed to break Kanye and rebuild him piece by piece until there was no Kanye left, just a perfect industry puppet. I watched in silence as Kanye's body began to relax, his breathing becoming deeper, slower. The room felt heavy as the hypnotist continued his work, but the air wasn't just thick with tension, it was thick with something else. Control. The industry had always been about control, about shaping stars to fit their vision, but this felt different. It felt like they were taking control of a man's very mind, his soul, and they didn't care who got in their way. Minutes passed, and I could see the change starting to happen again. Kanye's face, once full of expression, now looked like blank canvas. His usual intensity, the fire that made him who he was, began to fade, replaced by an eerie calmness. His hands, which had once been expressive, started to clench. I could see the tension growing beneath his calm exterior. I knew something awful was unfolding, but I couldn't stop it. I felt a chill run down my spine as the hypnotist's voice became more insistent, more commanding. Relax. Let go. Surrender. With each word, Kanye's body became more and more still. His eyes remained closed, but something was happening behind them. A shift in his mind, a darkness that was slowly creeping in. I could almost hear the sound of his thoughts cracking, the pieces of his identity falling away like dry leaves in the wind. Then came the moment I would never forget. Kanye's hand twitched. At first, it was so small, almost unnoticeable. But it wasn't just a twitch. It was as if he was fighting against the force that was taking him. He resisted, but the more he fought, the more tired he became. It was as if his mind had been tethered to something beyond his control, something stronger than anything he had ever faced before. The hypnotist sensed the resistance. With a quiet smile, he leaned closer. "You're fighting, but you don't have to. Surrender. Let go. Become the man you're meant to be." The command was clear. The voice was hypnotic. The words sank into Kanye's soul. I knew Kanye's mind was breaking, but worse than that, I realized. The industry had turned him into something else, something unrecognizable. This wasn't about unlocking his true potential anymore. This was about turning him into a machine, a product for the masses, someone who could be controlled, molded, and discarded when they were done with him. As the session ended, Kanye's eyes fluttered open. He looked around the room, his gaze cold, detached. There was no warmth in him anymore. The Kanye I knew, the Kanye who had been so full of life, was gone. In his place was a stranger. I could feel it. I could see it in the way he held himself, the way he looked at us all like we were part of the machinery, just another cog in the system. And I knew, in that moment, that Kanye was lost. Not to the industry, but to the hypnosis that had changed him forever. The industry had done it. They had taken him, reprogrammed him, and turned him into their perfect creation. And I realized, with sickening clarity, that there was no going back for Kanye. It wasn't long after that second session that the cracks began to show, and I couldn't look away. Kanye's transformation was accelerating in ways I hadn't anticipated. He wasn't just slipping away anymore. It was as if he were disintegrating piece by piece, his mind splintering into something unrecognizable. His genius was still there, but it was tainted, distorted, warped by whatever was happening behind closed doors. It wasn't just his art that had changed. It was him. At first, it was subtle. His once sharp, biting commentary became strange, distant. He'd start conversations only to forget the point halfway through. It wasn't normal forgetfulness. It was like his mind was slipping into a fog he couldn't escape. His eyes no longer held that fiery passion that used to spark with every word he spoke. Instead, they seemed hollow, lost. There were moments when it was as if he wasn't even fully present. I'd look into his eyes and wonder if anyone was still home. I remember the first time I really noticed it, really felt it. We were backstage at a show, a new performance he had been building up for weeks. His fans were expecting the old Kanye, the unapologetic, brilliant creator who fed off the energy of the crowd. But something in his demeanor that night was different. It was like he was just going through the motions, as if the real Kanye West had been replaced by a puppet on a string. He barely responded to the team around him. His answers were short, robotic. Every conversation felt like I was talking to someone who barely remembered their own name. The first major breakdown came during sound check. We were standing by the stage, waiting for him to run through the set. He walked out, took the microphone, and just stood there. No music, no energy, just silence. His eyes were fixed on the crowd as though he could see them, but he wasn't really there. I called his name, trying to break him from the trance-like state, but he didn't react. The crew started getting nervous, whispering to each other, but I stayed still, watching as Kanye stood frozen, a prisoner in his own body. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he dropped the mic and walked off without a word. The crew scrambled to fill the silence, but I stood there, heart pounding, knowing something was terribly wrong. I had seen Kanye at his highest moments, confident, commanding the room with every word. But this was a version of him that barely even knew who he was, and I could feel it. The more they hypnotized him, the further he slipped away. For the next few days, the world continued as if nothing had happened. His team handled the public side, the concerts, the interviews. But behind the scenes, I watched as Kanye's deterioration continued. He was no longer the man I had seen rise from the underground to global superstardom. He wasn't even a shell of him anymore. He was something else, a broken machine forced to keep working. One night, as I was walking down the hall toward his dressing room, I overheard a conversation between his manager and a few other high-level industry folks. They spoke in hushed tones, but I caught enough to know the truth. The hypnosis wasn't just a one-time thing. It had become a regular part of his routine now. It was no longer just about unlocking his potential. The industry had a vested interest in keeping him this way and controlling him. The hypnosis wasn't some mystical tool for creating genius. It was a way to keep him compliant, to make sure the industry could continue to profit off his fragility. My stomach churned as I realized just how far they had gone. Kanye had become a puppet, manipulated not just for his talent, but for his very mind. They were controlling everything, his thoughts, his emotions, his actions. He had been reduced to nothing more than a tool. I was disgusted, but there was nothing I could do. Then came the most telling sign of all. It wasn't just his behavior that was changing, it was his appearance. At first, I thought it was just exhaustion, the toll of touring and constant pressure. But as the weeks went on, it became clear. Kanye wasn't sleeping, he wasn't eating properly, and his physical health was plummeting. He looked gaunt, hollow-eyed, like someone who had been running on fumes for far too long. He began having frequent headaches, waking up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat and trembling uncontrollably. I had never seen him so vulnerable, so completely broken. There were moments, fleeting ones, where I saw the old Kanye, the fire behind his eyes, the wit in his smile. But those moments were becoming rarer, slipping further and further out of his reach. And when I tried to talk to him, to ask if he was okay, he would just stare at me blankly, as if he couldn't remember who I was. Or worse, didn't care. I could feel the tension growing with every passing day. Something in me wanted to scream, to shake him, to bring back the Kanye that had once felt so alive. But every time I got close, every time I saw that flicker of recognition in his eyes, it was snuffed out by the hypnosis, the manipulation. And as much as I hated it, I knew I was powerless. The industry had done this to him, and they were using him. And worse, they were breaking him, until nothing remained. Kanye's music still came out. New albums, new singles, all praised for their originality and depth. But what no one knew was that every note he created, every lyric he penned, wasn't purely him. It was a reflection of the monster the industry had made him. Every song, every verse was a product of a mind that was no longer truly his own. And I couldn't help but wonder how long it would be before the machine that had built him would discard him just like every other star they had used and thrown away. The worst part? Kanye didn't know how far gone he was. He thought he was still in control, still the same Kanye he had been. but he wasn't. And deep down, I knew that the worst was yet to come. Kanye's breakdown was no longer a matter of when. It had become a matter of how much longer he could keep it together before the industry's grip on him snapped him in half. I had watched him fall apart, piece by piece, but now it was clear. The people around him weren't trying to fix him. They were trying to shape him, make him into something he was never meant to be. And they were doing it with ruthless precision. The transformation I witnessed wasn't just physical or mental. It was psychological. And it had become so deeply embedded that I realized Kanye wasn't just being manipulated. He was being rebuilt. The industry had a hand in every aspect of his life now, from the way he thought to the way he reacted to the world around him. Every decision he made, every move he took was orchestrated. And the scariest part was, he didn't even realize it anymore. I started to notice the patterns. When Kanye walked into a room, it wasn't just Kanye West who entered. It was whatever version of him the industry wanted to see. There were days when he was the arrogant, defiant artist who could take on the world. Then there were days when he was a hollow shell, emotionless, like a puppet just going through the motions. I couldn't tell who was the real Kanye anymore. I had known him for years, seen him at his highest highs and lowest lows, but this was different. This man, this version of him, was no longer himself. It wasn't just the lack of emotion, it was the way his moods shifted. One minute he'd be calm, eerily serene, as if the world around him didn't even exist. Then, out of nowhere, his temper would flare. It was like watching a light switch being flipped on and off, controlled, deliberate, and manipulated. Kanye wasn't losing himself anymore. He was being constructed, and it was terrifying to watch. The first time I realized just how much control the industry had over him was during a meeting at his studio. Kanye was supposed to be there to discuss his next project, but instead, he barely said a word. His manager, a tall, sharp-dressed woman, stood beside him, guiding every part of the conversation. At first, I thought it was just because Kanye was tired, or maybe he was just having one of his usual off days. But then, I noticed something chilling. Kanye wasn't just quiet. He was completely passive. He followed every command from his manager, his eyes barely blinking, his hands resting neatly in his lap like he had no will of his own. Every time his manager spoke, it was as if Kanye was a puppet being moved on strings, his answers automatic, his tone distant. He didn't seem engaged at all. At one point, when the conversation shifted to the direction of his next album, his manager casually tossed out a suggestion, and Kanye nodded along with it, agreeing without hesitation. Normally, Kanye would have pushed back, argued about his creative vision, but instead, he just sat there, empty, agreeing with everything that was being said. It was like he didn't even know how to disagree anymore. The moment the meeting ended, I pulled Kanye aside, trying to get him alone. His eyes locked onto mine, but they were vacant, like looking into a mirror that didn't reflect back a face. I asked him how he was doing, if he was okay, but he didn't answer immediately. His mouth opened, then closed. It was like he didn't know what to say. Are you all right? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He looked at me, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw a flicker of recognition, a spark of the old Kanye. But then it vanished, replaced by the coldness I had come to recognize. He didn't respond. Instead, he simply nodded, then turned and walked away without another word. The feeling that hit me in that moment was like being hit by a truck. Kanye wasn't just falling apart. He was being reformed by the very people who had promised to elevate him. He was being molded, and worse, he was allowing it. From that moment on, I started paying closer attention to how everyone around Kanye spoke to him, interacted with him. The hypnotist, the producers, even his closest friends. They didn't just support him, they controlled him. They spoke to him like he was a child, guiding him every step of the way, controlling his every thought, shaping his identity. The Kanye who had once rebelled against the world's expectations had been tamed. And now, he was a reflection of the industry's demands. The worst part? He wasn't even aware of it. They had broken him so thoroughly that he didn't know who he was anymore. He was simply a shell, a puppet, and they pulled the strings. One night, I overheard something I wish I hadn't. I was at a party surrounded by industry professionals when I heard a conversation that made my stomach drop. The words hung in the air, slicing through the music and chatter like a knife. "Kanye's getting out of hand," one of the executives said. "He's slipping. We need to push him harder. We need to get him back on track." Another voice chimed in, smoother this time. "Let's bring him in for a session. We'll realign him. He'll be fine." "He's a machine now," came the reply. "He just needs to be maintained." That was the moment I realized the truth. Kanye was no longer a man. He was a tool, an asset in their machine, and they would use him until he had nothing left to give. That night, as I left the party, I couldn't shake the feeling of being trapped. The industry had won. They had broken Kanye and rebuilt him into someone he didn't recognize. And worse, someone who didn't recognize himself anymore. And as much as I hated it, I knew this was only the beginning. The worst was yet to come. It was only a matter of time before Kanye's internal collapse started to show. I had seen it coming for weeks, maybe even months. I'd watched him turn from the passionate, defiant artist I had admired into someone unrecognizable. But the worst part was that he didn't even know it. The industry had created a monster, and they had stripped away the very thing that made him human, his identity. The more I observed Kanye, the clearer it became that he wasn't just struggling with fame or the pressure, or even his mental health. He wasn't just unraveling. He was being erased. Every time I looked at him, it felt like I was seeing a little less of the person I once knew. His mind was no longer his own. It had become a battleground, warped by forces far beyond his control. I'll never forget the night he completely snapped. We were backstage at a show, and it was supposed to be another one of those high-energy performances. Kanye's fans were waiting. The audience was buzzing. The music was thumping in the background. Everything was set up for another iconic performance. But Kanye wasn't there. He was standing in the corner, alone, staring into space, the same vacant expression he had worn for weeks. I approached him cautiously, unsure of what I was walking into, but I had to know. Was he still in there? "Kanye?" I asked, my voice almost a whisper. He turned to me slowly, like I had just interrupted his thoughts, but there was nothing in his eyes. No spark, no anger, no fire, just emptiness. It was the most unsettling thing I had ever seen. He blinked once, twice, as though trying to figure out who I was. His lips parted, but no words came out. I waited, trying to make sense of what I was witnessing, but I knew, deep down, Whatever had been left of Kanye was already gone. When he finally spoke, his voice was so faint, so detached, that it barely reached my ears. I don't know who I am anymore. That one sentence, more than anything else, crushed me. The Kanye West I had admired, fought alongside, cheered for, the man who had broken barriers with his art, his words, his beliefs, was gone. In his place was someone else, a man who didn't even recognize himself, a man who had been broken beyond repair, who had been systematically stripped of his identity by the very people who claimed to build him up. The worst part wasn't just that Kanye had no control over his own life anymore. It was that he didn't want control. It was as if he had surrendered, fully, completely, to the powers that had manipulated him. Every word he spoke, every move he made, felt like it was being guided by invisible hands, pulling him in one direction while he had no choice but to follow. I tried to shake him out of it, tried to get him to wake up, but nothing worked. He stared blankly ahead, too deep in the trance the industry had put him in to even hear me. I called for help, and a few of his team members rushed in, but all they did was usher him away, out of the room, out of sight. They didn't care. All they cared about was that the show went on. To them, Kanye wasn't a person anymore. He was just a product that needed to be kept in line. What happened next was something I'll never forget. That night, the show went on without him. They brought in a body double, someone who could fill in for Kanye on stage, moving through the motions with all the right energy, but none of the soul. The audience had no idea. The cameras never caught the shift. The world continued to watch as if nothing had changed, while in the background, the real Kanye, the man who had created all of this, was slowly being eaten alive by the very system that had made him famous. It wasn't just the public that was fooled. It was Kanye himself. He was no longer the man behind the music. He was a shell, empty and hollow, moving through his career like a robot. The industry had taken his essence, his mind, his spirit, and in exchange, they had given him fame, wealth, and perpetual motion. But at what cost? I couldn't stop watching him deteriorate. Every time I saw him, whether it was during rehearsals or in private, I could feel the sadness that had replaced everything he once stood for. It was as if the procedure they had put him through had erased all his convictions, all his beliefs, until there was nothing left but a puppet whose strings were pulled by an unseen hand. The team around him had become complicit in the process. They were too deep into the machine to care about Kanye's humanity anymore. He was a tool to them, an asset to be exploited until he could no longer perform. And that day was coming soon. I could feel it. But even as Kanye fell apart, the industry continued to push him. They called for more performances, more public appearances. And the world continued to consume Kanye's broken version, applauding his work, praising his art, while never knowing the cost of what they were really seeing. They were watching a man's soul slowly disintegrate before their eyes, all for the sake of the next big hit. And what did Kanye have left? Nothing. No self, no identity, no control. He'd become exactly what they wanted him to be, a tool, a product that could be molded, shaped, and discarded when he no longer served their purposes. I couldn't help but feel responsible, even though I knew I had done nothing wrong. I had watched it happen, watched them break him down. And now, Kanye was just another casualty of the machine that had created him, destroyed him and would eventually leave him behind when he was no longer useful. He was lost, and it was a loss that could never be undone. By the time Kanye's breakdown became undeniable, the industry had already moved on. They had used him, transformed him, and now they were ready to discard him. Kanye had long since stopped being an artist, a creative force, or even a person. They had stripped him down to a product, something they could mold and manipulate until he no longer served their purpose. And when he didn't, they would simply replace him. That's what the industry did. It chewed up its stars and spit them out, and Kanye was no exception. What had been clear for weeks, even months, was now impossible to ignore. Kanye wasn't coming back. The man who had once written the soundtrack of an entire generation, who had commanded attention, who had shaken the world with every release, was now nothing more than a shadow of himself, lost in the system that had built him. And the scariest part was, he didn't even know it. His last performances were a blur, stiff, lifeless, the energy from the crowd barely even reaching him. On stage, he had become robotic, moving through the motions like he was following a script. The man who once owned the spotlight now seemed to barely notice the crowd. He wasn't even there anymore. Not fully. What had once been Kanye was gone, and in its place was a shell, a puppet, manipulated by forces he didn't understand. I couldn't bring myself to watch him anymore. Every time I saw him, I could feel the emptiness inside him, the gaping hole where his identity used to be. The darkness was so profound, I could almost taste it. His eyes had become hollow, his expressions completely flat. He spoke, but the words didn't have the same weight. His voice had lost its power, its intensity. It was like someone had drained the very essence of him and left behind only an echo. The hypnotism that had started as a tool for control had now completely consumed him. Behind closed doors, the team continued to push him. The machine didn't stop. Kanye's management team was still booking him for interviews, press tours, concerts, anything that could keep the industry's engine running. They treated him like a marionette, moving him here and there, getting him to say the right things, do the right things. But he was no longer Kanye West. He was an entity, a brand, a product that was being used to turn a profit. The real Kanye had disappeared. I overheard a conversation one night and left me sick to my stomach. I was sitting in the back of the studio trying to pretend I wasn't eavesdropping, but I couldn't ignore the words I was hearing. The manager was talking to an exec, and they were discussing Kanye's recovery. The word itself made me want to laugh, if it weren't so tragic. "He's fine," the manager said, voice smooth, reassuring. "He's just adjusting to the next phase. We're pushing him a little harder now, but it's all part of the plan. This is what we've always wanted, the perfect version of Kanye. He's the product now, and as long as he performs, he'll keep delivering for us." I could feel the bile rise in my throat. The perfect version of Kanye? What they had created wasn't the perfect version of anything. It was a broken man, a puppet, whose strings were pulled by people who didn't care about him, didn't care about his soul. To them, he was just a tool, something to make money off of. And once they were done with him, once he had nothing left to give, they would throw him away like they had done to so many before him. The industry's hunger for control had consumed Kanye entirely. They didn't need him to think for himself anymore. They didn't need him to be a genius. All they needed was for him to perform, to continue churning out art that sold, to be the icon they had created. And he did. As much as it killed me to admit it, Kanye still produced music. His albums continued to hit the charts, and his performances were still met with frenzied applause, but none of it was real. His art was no longer a reflection of his soul. It was a reflection of the machine that had manipulated him, molded him into something that could be controlled. Every beat, every lyric felt manufactured, designed to fit the image they had created for him. The public never knew. They never saw the struggle behind the music, the emptiness behind the eyes of the man they idolized. They cheered, they praised, they worshiped the brand that was Kanye West. But they had no idea that the real Kanye had long since faded away. I couldn't take it anymore. I couldn't watch as they pushed him further into the abyss, unable to stop the inevitable. Kanye was lost, and there was nothing left of him to save. The industry had turned him into a machine, and now they were working him until he had nothing left to give. There was no escape. Kanye had become a shell, trapped in a system that owned him, and no one was there to help him. No one cared enough to step in. The system had won, and Kanye had lost. But what terrified me more than anything was that Kanye's story wasn't unique. There would be others, other artists, other stars who would fall into the same trap, manipulated, controlled, used up, and discarded. And the world would never know the cost of their success. The worst part? They would do it all over again. And Kanye would never be the last. The world had moved on. Kanye's music still graced the charts. His name still sold out stadiums, and his face remained plastered across every magazine, every social media feed. To the outside world, nothing had changed. He was still the icon, the genius, the unpredictable star they had always adored. But I knew the truth. The real Kanye West was gone. And what was left was just a caricature, a product of the industry that had swallowed him whole. There were whispers in the halls of the studio, murmurs behind closed doors about his next big thing. But the industry no longer cared about Kanye, the person. They cared about the brand. He wasn't a man anymore. He was an asset, something that could be molded, shaped, and marketed to the masses. They didn't care about his mind, his soul, or his sanity. They only cared about what he could give them. But the cracks were starting to show. It was becoming harder for the machine to keep the illusion intact. Kanye's breakdowns were more frequent, more public. The voices in his head that had once whispered in the shadows were now louder, clearer. And each time, I saw the terror in his eyes. He wasn't just hearing voices anymore. He was losing himself bit by bit as the hypnosis they had inflicted on him began to unravel. One night, in a quiet moment backstage, I caught a glimpse of Kanye, the real Kanye, if only for a split second. He was alone, standing in front of a mirror, staring at himself with a look of utter confusion. His reflection seemed to mock him, as if he was staring at a stranger. It was the first time I saw him truly aware of what had happened. It was as if, for the first time, the veil had lifted, and Kanye could see the truth. He was no longer the man he had once been. He reached out to touch the mirror, his fingers trembling, and for a moment, I thought he might break down, might fight back. But the world moved on, and so did he. He didn't scream, he didn't rage. He simply turned away, his face blank, like he had already accepted the fate that had been sealed for him. He was no longer Kanye West. He was the industry's creation, and that was all he could ever be. I couldn't help but feel a deep sorrow for him. The man who had once stood so tall, so defiant, had been reduced to this. But I also felt guilt. I had watched it happen. I had seen them turn him into this thing, this empty shell, and I had done nothing. Kanye's story was a cautionary tale, a reminder of the dangers of fame, of how the industry could take someone's soul, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but a product, a machine that could perform for the masses, but could never be free. And the scariest part? Kanye was just the beginning. There would be others, artists, icons, stars, who would be swallowed up by the same system, chewed up and spit out when they no longer served a purpose. The machine would keep turning. But Kanye, he was gone. The man who had once changed the world with his music, his words, his vision, was lost to the very machine that had made him famous. And nothing, not even the industry's control, could ever bring him back. The industry created a monster. But in the end, it wasn't just Kanye who had been broken. It was all of us, because we were complicit in his destruction. And now, the world would never know the true cost of his success.